The guy came to my house to buy a dresser, and the first thing he asked me was why I had moved my bed. I had never seen him before, and the pictures in my Craigslist ad didn't show my bed. I had been getting rid of furniture because I was moving into a smaller apartment. The dresser was an old wooden one I'd had since college, and I put it on Craigslist for $70. I took 3 pictures of it. That was all. One from the front, one from the side, and one showing the drawers. I posted the ad on a Sunday night. The next morning, a guy named Tyler messaged me asking if it was still available. We exchanged a few messages and agreed he'd come by around 5 that afternoon. At around 5:15, I saw a silver SUV pull into my driveway. A guy got out and walked up to the house. He looked completely normal. Maybe late 20s, baseball cap, dark jacket. I opened the door. "Tyler?" "Yeah." He smiled and said, "Hey man." I moved aside so he could see the dresser. He walked into my bedroom, looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, and then looked over at my bed. "Did you move this?" I thought he meant the dresser. "What?" He pointed at the bed. "The bed. It was against the other wall, right?" I just looked at him. I didn't know what to say. There was no picture of my bed in the Craigslist ad. Not even part of it. I said, "No, it's always been there." He laughed a little. I could have sworn it was somewhere else. I told myself he had probably seen the room from the doorway and just gotten confused. He opened one of the dresser drawers. "Everything work?" "Yeah." He paid me cash. We carried the dresser outside. While we were putting it into his SUV, he asked me if I lived alone. I said, "Most of the time." He nodded. Then he asked, "Your girlfriend stays here a lot?" That one caught me off guard. I looked at him. "No." "Why?" He shrugged. "Just asking." He closed the back of the SUV and said thanks. Then he drove away. I remember standing in my driveway watching the SUV disappear and thinking the whole thing had been weird, but not necessarily dangerous. I figured maybe he'd seen my house somewhere online. A lot of property listings had old photos, so I searched my address that night. There were some old real estate photos, but none showed the bedroom. The next morning, I got a message through Craigslist from an account with no name. It said, "Nice view from your bedroom window." I stared at it. I didn't respond. I checked my listing again. The bedroom window was visible in one of the dresser photos, but only a small section of it. The curtains were completely closed. I deleted the message. About 10 minutes later, another one came in. "Move the lamp away from the window." That was when I started getting uncomfortable. The lamp wasn't visible in any of the pictures. I blocked the account. I called my girlfriend and told her what happened. She thought Tyler had probably searched my address online or found something on social media. That was possible, so I left it alone. 2 nights later, I was getting ready for bed when I noticed my bedroom window was open. I always closed it before sleeping. Always. I checked the window frame. There were a couple of small scratches on the outside. I didn't know if they were new. I closed and locked it. The next morning, one of the neighbors mentioned seeing somebody walking around the side of my house late the previous night. That made me call the police. An officer came over and looked around. There was no obvious sign that anyone had broken in. He asked me whether I had recently let anyone into the house. I told him about the Craigslist buyer. He took down Tyler's information. Then he asked to see the listing. I pulled it up on my phone. He looked through the pictures. Then he zoomed in on one. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. He finally asked, "Did you take this picture yourself?" I said yes. He pointed at the bedroom window. "Look there." At first I thought it was just a reflection. Then I realized there was a person standing outside the window. You could only see part of them. The picture had caught their reflection in the glass. Someone had been outside my bedroom while I was taking the picture. I couldn't remember seeing anybody. The officer asked me when I took it. I checked the original photo on my phone. It had been taken at around 8 that night. I remembered that evening. My girlfriend had been in the living room. I had been alone in the bedroom taking pictures of the dresser. The officer said he couldn't do much unless there was evidence someone had actually entered the property. He suggested I get a camera for the side of the house. I bought one the next day. For about a week, nothing happened. Then, one night, around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed. The camera had detected movement near the side entrance. I opened the live feed. I couldn't see anyone. The camera only showed the side of the house and part of the fence. Then the motion alert went off again. This time, something moved across the bottom of the frame. A hand. Someone was standing directly under the camera. I called the police. By the time they got there, nobody was outside, but one of the officers found a small black device attached underneath my air conditioning unit. It was a tiny camera. It was aimed directly at my bedroom window. I felt sick when he showed it to me. I asked how long it had been there. He couldn't tell. They took it with them. The next day, I went through all the Craigslist messages from the previous few months. I had sold a desk, a nightstand, a floor lamp, an old office chair, nothing expensive. But I noticed something I hadn't thought about before. Several of the buyers had asked similar questions. Did I live alone? Was the building quiet? Was parking easy? What time was I usually home? At the time, those questions hadn't seemed important. Now they did. I gave all the messages to the police. They started looking into the accounts. I never found out exactly who Tyler was. His Craigslist account disappeared. The phone number he gave me stopped working, and I never saw that silver SUV again. A few weeks later, I moved. Before I left, I deleted my old Craigslist account completely. I didn't want anything connected to me anymore. About 2 months after I moved, I was looking for a used desk online. I happened to check Craigslist again. There was a listing for a dresser. The picture made my stomach drop. It was my dresser, the exact same one. I knew it because there was a small black mark on the bottom drawer that I had put there years earlier. The seller had posted my old address, and the description said, "Good condition, pickup only, seller lives alone." I reported the listing. It disappeared later that day. I never found out who posted it, but I still think about the first thing Tyler said when he walked into my bedroom. He asked why I had moved the bed. He wasn't confused. He was remembering it. The guy who came to buy my old pressure washer spent more time looking at my garage than the pressure washer. I noticed it almost immediately. I just didn't understand why until a few days later. I had bought the pressure washer a couple of years earlier and barely used it. When I decided to move into an apartment, I started selling things I didn't need anymore. I put it on Craigslist for $60. A guy named Brandon messaged me that night. He asked if it still worked. I said yes. He asked how old it was. I told him. Then he asked whether I lived in a house or an apartment. I thought that was a little strange, but I answered. He said he'd come by the next afternoon. Around 4, a dark gray SUV pulled into my driveway. Brandon got out. He looked completely normal. Maybe early 30s. Jeans, gray hoodie, baseball cap. He walked straight toward the garage. I opened the door and pointed at the pressure washer. He barely looked at it. Instead, he looked around, at the shelves, the side door, the windows, then the door leading from the garage into my house. I said, "It's right here." He nodded. "Yeah." He crouched beside the pressure washer and pulled the cord once. It started. He shut it off. Then he asked, "You keep anything valuable in here?" I laughed because I thought he was joking. "No." He looked at the shelves again. "Okay." He picked up the machine. Before carrying it outside, he asked, "What time do you usually get home?" I looked at him. "Why?" He smiled. "Just making sure I'm not blocking you if I come back for the hose." I hadn't mentioned a hose. I told him he could pick one up later if he wanted. He said he would. He paid me cash and carried the pressure washer to his SUV. Before leaving, he looked down the driveway toward the street. Then he asked, "Your neighbor always parks that truck there?" I said, "Yeah." He nodded. Then he left. I remember standing there after he drove away, thinking the guy had been weird. Not scary, just weird. That night, I mentioned it to my girlfriend. She said maybe he was interested in the neighborhood. I forgot about him. 3 days later, I came home from work and noticed the garage door was open about 6 inches. I always closed it. I know because I had gotten into the habit of checking it twice before leaving for work. I walked over and pressed the button. The door opened. Nothing looked disturbed. I checked my tools. Everything was there. The side door was locked. I went inside. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Brandon. I checked the security camera covering my driveway. It hadn't recorded anything unusual. The next morning, I found a small scratch near the lock on the side garage door. It wasn't enough to prove someone had tried getting in. Still, I bought a new lock. That afternoon, I got a Craigslist message. It was from Brandon. "Hey, sorry about the other day. Forgot to ask something." I replied, "What?" He said, "Do you have cameras?" I stared at the message. I didn't answer. A minute later, he sent another. "Never mind." Then he deleted both messages. I blocked him. That night, around 11, my doorbell camera sent me a motion alert. Someone was standing at the end of my driveway. I opened the live feed. The person was too far away to make out. I watched for maybe 30 seconds. Then they walked away. I checked the recording. They had been there for almost 3 minutes. Just standing there. The next morning, I noticed something on my front door. A small strip of clear tape. Almost invisible. It had been placed across the edge of the door and frame. I didn't know why. Then I remembered something. When Brandon had been looking at the pressure washer, he had asked me to open the side garage door because he wanted to see whether the machine fit through it. I had walked around and opened it. He had stayed inside the garage alone for maybe 20 seconds. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. Now I wondered what he had been doing. I called the police and told them what had happened. An officer came by. He looked at the tape. Then he checked the garage. Nothing. He asked me what Brandon had bought. I told him. The officer asked whether I'd sold anything else recently. I said no. Then he asked whether Brandon had ever come back. I told him no. He said there wasn't much they could do without evidence. That evening, I got another Craigslist message. Different account. Same phone number. It said, "Pressure washer still working?" I didn't answer. Then, just kidding. I blocked the account. A few minutes later, my girlfriend called me from the kitchen. She said the back door was unlocked. I told her I had locked it. We checked the whole house. Nothing was missing. But there was a muddy footprint near the laundry room. Just one. It pointed toward the garage. I called the police again. They came back. This time, the officer noticed something near the bottom of the garage door. A tiny piece of clear plastic had been wedged between the door and the floor. He pulled it out. It was part of a small doorstop. He looked at me. "Have you been using this?" I said no. He asked whether I'd noticed the garage door sitting slightly open before. I said yes. He explained that if somebody wanted to know whether I was home, they could leave something like that in place so the door wouldn't fully close. He couldn't prove that's what had happened. But it made sense. Then he asked me something. "When the buyer was here, did he know whether you were alone?" I remembered what Brandon had asked. What time I got home. Whether I lived in a house. Whether I had cameras. I said yes. The officer wrote it down. A few days later, detectives contacted me. They had found the same phone number connected to several Craigslist accounts. Different names. Different items. Pressure washers. Leaf blowers. Ladders. Shop vacuums. Cheap tools. The interesting part was what happened after each sale. Most buyers reported some kind of follow-up. A strange text. Someone checking the house. A door left open. A person asking about work schedules. Nobody had enough evidence to connect those things to the Craigslist buyers. But the pattern was there. The detectives told me the items themselves probably weren't important. The buyer wanted a reason to be inside people's garages. He could see what kind of cars they drove, whether there were security cameras, whether the garage connected to the house, what tools were there, and whether anyone else was home. They never found Brandon. His Craigslist account disappeared. The phone number went dead. I moved into my apartment a few months later. I eventually sold the house. About 6 months after moving, I was cleaning old email on my phone when I found the original Craigslist conversation. I had forgotten about one message. Brandon had sent it right before he came to my house. I had never noticed it because it was buried between our other messages. It said, "Do you have anything else in the garage?" I had replied, "No. Just the pressure washer." At the time, I thought he was asking because he wanted to buy more stuff. Now I think he was asking something else. He wanted to know exactly how much of my garage he would get to look at. And the part I still think about is this. He wasn't interested in the pressure washer. He was interested in everything I had around it. I sold an old camera on Craigslist once, and the person who bought it came back to my house that same night. The strange part was that he had already paid me for it. The camera was nothing special. It was an older Canon DSLR I hadn't used in years. I listed it for $100 because I just wanted it gone. A guy named Ryan messaged me the next morning. He asked if everything worked. I told him the camera worked fine. He asked if I still had the original battery charger. I said yes. He said he'd pick it up after work. Around 6:30, a dark blue sedan pulled into my driveway. A guy got out and walked toward the house. He looked to be in his 30s. He had a hoodie on, even though it wasn't particularly cold. I opened the garage because that's where I'd put the camera. He looked at it and asked me to turn it on. I did. He took a few pictures. Then he asked me if I was the only person who had used it. I said, "As far as I know." He smiled. Good. I remember thinking that was a weird response. I handed him the charger. He counted out the money. Then he asked, "You don't have the original memory card?" I told him no. He said that was fine. He took the camera and left. The whole thing probably lasted 5 minutes. About an hour later, I got a message through Craigslist. Found the charger. Thanks. I thought that was it. Then another message came in. Your house looks different at night. I stared at my phone. I hadn't sent him any pictures of my house. I looked at the conversation. There was nothing from me showing the outside of the house. I replied, "What do you mean?" He never answered. I figured he had probably driven past the house again. I didn't think much of it until around 11:40 that night. I was sitting on my couch watching television when I heard what sounded like a car door closing outside. I looked through the front window. Nothing. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps on the driveway. They stopped near the side of the house. I turned off the television. Then I heard a quiet knock on the kitchen door. That didn't make sense. Nobody used that door. I got up and looked through the glass. No one was standing there. I checked the camera on my doorbell. There was nothing on the porch. I walked back to the living room. Then my phone buzzed. It was Ryan. Forgot something. I didn't answer. A second message came through. Can you bring it outside? I looked toward the kitchen. I knew he wasn't asking about the charger. He already had it. I called him. He didn't pick up. I locked the doors and shut off the lights. About 10 minutes later, the motion detector on my driveway went off. I opened the security app. A person was standing beside my garage. I couldn't make out the face. I called the police. By the time an officer arrived, the person was gone. They searched around the property and didn't find anyone. The officer asked whether I'd recently sold anything to the person. I told him about the camera. He wrote down Ryan's name and number. Then he asked me something that I hadn't considered. Was the camera connected to Wi-Fi? I said no. He nodded. Okay. He asked me to show him where I'd kept it before selling it. I took him to the small office upstairs. The camera had been sitting on a shelf. There was nothing unusual there. He looked around. Then he asked what I usually use the camera for. I told him mostly vacations and family events. He looked at me. Did you ever leave it recording? No. He left shortly afterward. I barely slept. The next morning, I checked Craigslist. Ryan's account was gone. I searched his phone number on mine. Nothing. Then I noticed something about the camera listing that I'd never thought about. The pictures I had uploaded showed the camera sitting on the desk in my office. Behind it, you could see a framed photo. It was small, but it was a picture of my family standing in front of my house. I realized anyone who zoomed in could identify the neighborhood. That still didn't explain how Ryan knew what my house looked like at night. I decided to check the camera's old memory card. I had forgotten that I had left one inside. It was still in my desk drawer. I put it into my computer. Most of the files were old vacation pictures. But there were 2 videos I didn't recognize. Both were recorded while the camera was sitting inside my office. The first showed my driveway. The second showed the hallway leading toward my bedroom. The videos were from several months earlier. I froze. I knew exactly where the camera had been during that time. It had been sitting on the same shelf, but I had never turned it on. I checked the file dates again. The videos had been recorded late at night. On one of the recordings, I saw myself walking down the hallway. I stopped. Then I noticed something in the background. Someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs, just for a second. Then they stepped backward and disappeared. I called the police again. This time, they took the memory card. They asked if anyone else had ever been inside the house. I gave them a list: friends, family, repair workers, anyone who might have had access. They eventually found the original camera's serial number connected to a Craigslist account that had been used several times. Ryan wasn't the real name. The account had been buying used cameras, baby monitors, old phones, and security equipment from people in the area. Most of the sellers hadn't reported anything suspicious, but several people had noticed strange things afterward. One woman said someone had knocked on her door late at night. Another said she started receiving messages asking what time she usually got home. The police believed the devices were being bought because of where they had been used, not because of the devices themselves. The person wanted to know what was inside the homes. They never found Ryan. I changed every lock. I upgraded the cameras around the house. I also stopped selling anything online that had ever been used inside my home. For a while, nothing happened. Then, about 3 months later, I got a message from a new Craigslist account. There was no name, no profile picture, just one sentence. "Do you still have the other camera?" I didn't own another camera. At least, I didn't think I did. I checked the house anyway. I found an old point-and-shoot camera in a box in the basement. I hadn't used it in years. I picked it up. The battery was dead. Then I noticed something underneath it. A small piece of masking tape with my old address written on it. I had no memory of putting it there. I threw the camera away. I deleted the Craigslist message, and I haven't sold anything online since. But what still bothers me is something I noticed on one of the old videos after the police gave me a copy. The person standing at the bottom of my stairs was wearing a dark hoodie, the same kind of hoodie Ryan was wearing when he came to buy the camera. The video was recorded 4 months before I ever listed that camera on Craigslist, which means he wasn't there because of the listing. He was already there. The guy who bought my old lawnmower knew my neighbor's name before I ever told him where I lived. That was the first thing that bothered me. The second was that he wasn't actually interested in the lawnmower. I had put it on Craigslist because I was moving into an apartment and didn't need it anymore. It was an older Craftsman push mower. It still worked, but it was loud and took a couple of pulls to start. I listed it for $50. A few hours later, a guy named Jason messaged me. He didn't ask whether it started. He asked if the person who lived in the blue house next door was still there. I thought maybe he was trying to find the right address. I told him yes. He replied, "The guy with the white truck?" That made me pause. I hadn't posted a picture of my house. I hadn't mentioned my neighbor. I asked him how he knew what my neighbor's house looked like. He said, "I've driven through there before." I didn't think much of it after that. We arranged for him to come by the next afternoon. Around 4:30, a dark SUV pulled up outside. Jason got out. He was probably in his late 30s and looked completely ordinary. He walked over to the mower. "Can I start it?" "Sure." He pulled the cord twice. It started. He shut it off and looked toward my neighbor's house, the blue one. He stood there for a second. Then he asked, "He's not home right now?" I said, "I don't think so." He nodded. "Good." I asked him why he cared. He smiled and said, "Just curious." He paid me. I helped him put the mower into his SUV. Before he left, he asked, "You guys get along?" I thought he meant me and my neighbor. "Yeah." "Why?" He shrugged. "No reason." Then he drove away. I remember standing there afterward thinking the guy was weird but not dangerous. My neighbor, Mark, was around my age. We weren't close, but we talked a lot over the years, mostly about lawn stuff, cars, and the neighborhood. That evening, I mentioned the Craigslist buyer to him. I told him the guy had asked about him. Mark didn't laugh. He asked me what the guy looked like. I described him. Mark thought for a moment. Then he said, "I've never seen him." I didn't think much of it. The next morning, Mark knocked on my door. He looked tired. He told me someone had been in his backyard. He had found footprints in the grass beside his garage. I asked whether he had checked his cameras. He had one pointing toward the driveway. The camera showed nothing. No person, no car, nothing. That night, around 11, I heard a vehicle slowly driving down our street. It stopped near my driveway. I looked through the blinds. A dark SUV was parked across the street. I couldn't see the driver. I watched for maybe a minute. Then it drove away. I assumed it was Jason. I didn't know his vehicle until I saw it. The next morning, Mark came over again. He asked me if I'd heard anything overnight. I told him about the SUV. His face changed. He said someone had tried the back door of his house. The handle had been pulled hard enough to leave marks around the lock. He had called the police. They came, but there was no way to know who had done it. I started feeling uncomfortable. I searched Jason's Craigslist profile. It had already been deleted. I still had his phone number. I called it. A woman answered. I asked for Jason. She said there was no Jason at that number. I apologized and hung up. That afternoon, I got a message from a new Craigslist account. You still live next to the blue house? I didn't answer. Another message came in. Does he leave for work around 7? I immediately called Mark. He told me he had never given Jason his schedule. I told him to call the police. He did. The police asked me to preserve all the messages. They also asked me whether I still had the lawnmower. I told them no. Then one officer asked me something that I hadn't thought about. Did the buyer ever actually use the mower? I said no. He had started it. That was all. The officer nodded. Okay. They didn't explain why they were asking. Later that evening, I was sitting in my living room when I heard something outside, a soft scraping sound. I looked through the window. The gate on the side of my house was moving. Someone was pushing it. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I didn't go outside. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps moving across the side yard. Then they stopped. Someone whispered my name. I don't know how long I stood there. Then I heard the person walk away. A patrol car arrived a few minutes later. They searched the yard. They didn't find anyone. But one officer found a small plastic bag beside the fence. Inside was a key. A house key. There was no label on it. The officer asked whether it was mine. It wasn't. He took it. The next morning, Mark called me. He said something had been left on his porch. It was an envelope. Inside was a printed photograph of his house. It had been taken from across the street. On the back was his full name, and underneath it was his work schedule. He called the police again. That's when they started taking the situation more seriously. They checked the old Craigslist messages. The account that bought my mower wasn't connected to a real name, but they found that the same phone number had been associated with several other Craigslist accounts. Most of them had purchased cheap household items, lawn equipment, ladders, old tools, a pressure washer, nothing unusual. But the addresses were all in the same few neighborhoods, and in several cases, the sellers lived close to another specific house. The police believed the purchases were just an excuse to get people to give away information about their homes. Who lived there? Who parked outside? Which neighbors knew each other? What time people usually left? The lawnmower had never been the point. I stopped using Craigslist after that. Mark installed cameras all around his house. About 2 weeks later, he called me late one night. He said he had finally caught somebody on camera. A man had walked into his backyard around 3 in the morning. The police came and took the footage. They couldn't identify him. But Mark later sent me a still image. It was blurry. The man was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. I couldn't see his face. Then Mark zoomed in. The man was carrying something. A lawnmower. The same lawnmower I had sold. Mark said the police found it dumped behind his garage. There was something attached to the handle. A small handwritten note. It had my address on it. But underneath my address was another line. Next house. I moved out of that neighborhood a month later. Mark sold his house the following year. I haven't heard anything since, but every once in a while, I think about the first message Jason sent me. He didn't ask whether the mower was still available. He asked whether the man in the blue house was still there. I used to think that was because he had already been watching the neighborhood. Now I think he was checking something, not whether Mark was there. Whether Mark was still worth watching. I was halfway through carrying a couch into my apartment when the guy selling it asked me to check whether his back door was locked. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to ask a stranger. I had found the couch on Craigslist for $80. The pictures looked fine, and the seller said he was moving out of state and needed it gone that weekend. His name was Daniel. We arranged for me to pick it up on Saturday morning. The house was about 30 minutes from mine, in a neighborhood I'd never been to. Daniel opened the front door before I knocked. He was probably in his 40s and looked tired. "Couch is right in the living room," he said. I walked inside. The house was almost completely empty. There were a few boxes against the walls, but most of the furniture was gone. The couch was heavier than it looked. I asked if anyone else was helping us. He said, "No, just us." We carried one end toward the front door. About halfway there, he stopped. "Wait," he set his end down. Then he looked toward the hallway. "Can you do me a favor?" I said, "Sure." He pointed toward the back of the house. "Just make sure the back door is locked." I thought maybe he was worried somebody had left it open. I walked down the hallway. The house was quiet. I found the back door. It was locked. I called back. "It's locked." He didn't answer. I walked back toward the living room. He was standing beside the couch staring at me. "What?" He smiled. "Nothing." We carried the couch outside. He helped me load it into my truck. Before I left, he said, "Appreciate it." I paid him and drove home. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I answered. He sounded nervous. "Hey, did you happen to notice anyone outside when you were there?" I said no. He asked what time I'd gotten there. I told him. Then he said, "Okay." I asked what was going on. He didn't answer directly. He just said, "Don't worry about it." Then he hung up. I thought that was strange, but I forgot about it. I brought the couch inside that afternoon. My apartment was on the first floor. Getting it through the doorway took forever. By the time I finished, it was around 4. I sat down. For the first time, I noticed a smell coming from underneath the couch. It smelled like cigarette smoke. I flipped the cushions over. Nothing. I checked underneath. There was a plastic bag taped to the bottom. Inside was a phone. Not a smartphone. One of those cheap prepaid phones with a small screen. It was turned on. I stared at it for a while. Then it rang. I nearly dropped it. I answered. No one said anything. I could hear breathing. Then the person whispered, "You took it." I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. I turned it off. I wasn't sure what it meant. I thought about taking the phone back to Daniel. Then I decided I didn't want to deal with him. I put it in a drawer. The next morning, there was someone knocking on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole. It was a man I'd never seen before. He was standing there with his hands in his pockets. I didn't open the door. He knocked again. Then he said, "I'm here for the phone." I froze. I didn't answer. He stood there for maybe 15 seconds. Then he walked away. I watched him from the window. He went down the sidewalk and got into a white van. I wrote down the license plate. Then I called Daniel. He didn't answer. I sent him a message. Someone just came to my apartment asking for the phone that was inside the couch. He responded almost immediately. "Did you give it to him?" I said no. There was a long pause. Then another message appeared. "Good." I asked what was going on. He didn't answer. Instead, he sent me an address. It wasn't his house. It was mine. My apartment building. Then he wrote, "Don't let anyone inside." I just stared at the message. A second later, someone knocked on my door again. This time I didn't go near it. I called the police and explained everything. While I was talking to them, I heard the person outside try the door handle. Then it stopped. The person left before officers arrived. The officers checked the hallway and the parking lot but didn't find anyone. I showed them the phone. One of them asked whether I had used it. I said no. He turned it over in his hand. There was no SIM card, no battery cover, nothing that would make it useful as a normal phone. He asked where I found it. I told him about the couch. One officer looked at the other. Then he asked me to tell the story again. This time, I mentioned everything. The back door. Daniel asking me to check it. His strange phone call. The man at my apartment. The officer asked whether I'd noticed anything else in the house when I picked up the couch. I said no. He asked me if the back door had been the only door I'd been asked to check. I said yes. Then he asked me something that made me realize what might have happened. Were you ever alone in that house? I thought about it. Yes. For maybe 30 seconds. When Daniel had me check the back door. The officer nodded. He said that could have been enough time for someone to move through another part of the house. I didn't understand. Then he explained what they were looking at. The couch might not have been sold because Daniel was moving. The house could have been used temporarily by people who needed somewhere to hide things. The phone might have been used as a way to communicate with someone nearby without keeping an active phone tied to a name, and whoever had been using it may have assumed the phone was still inside the house. Until I took the couch. I asked what was on the phone. The officer said they were going to examine it. I moved the couch into a storage unit that week. 3 days later, Daniel finally called me. I answered. He sounded exhausted. He said, "I'm sorry." I asked him who the guy was. He said, "I don't know." I didn't believe him. He said the house had belonged to his uncle. His uncle had died months earlier. People had apparently been getting into the property after it had been sitting empty. Daniel had started selling things to get rid of the evidence that people had been inside. I asked him why he hadn't told me. He said, "Because I thought they were looking for the phone." I asked whether he knew who they were. He said no. Then he said something that still bothers me. The couch wasn't supposed to leave the house. I asked what he meant. He said there was something underneath it. I told him I'd already found the phone. There was a long silence. Then he said, "That's not what I meant." The call ended. I never heard from him again. The police eventually told me the phone contained no useful information. There were no saved contacts, no messages, nothing they could use to identify anyone. I thought that was the end of it. A few months later, I sold the couch, not through Craigslist. I gave it away to a local charity. I didn't mention the phone. I just wanted it gone. About a week after that, I was cleaning my storage unit and found something I'd overlooked. A small piece of paper had been tucked inside the couch frame. It had one sentence written on it. "Check the back door before you leave." I still don't know who wrote it, but I know that when Daniel asked me to check that door, he wasn't worried about someone getting in. He was making sure someone was still there.